Happy Monday, everybody. Hope you're having a good day today so far. Hope you had a good weekend. Mine was good for the first time, and gosh, it seems like months. I finally have been feeling decent. I haven't been getting dizzy. I think the last time I started feeling dizzy again was on a Thursday. Thursday. And I took a Benadryl. It seems that every time I've been feeling dizzy due to like sinus congestion, if I take a Benadryl, I start to feel better. Although it does make me slightly groggy. If I take it with an energy drink, I don't get quite as tired, but at least the dizziness goes away. So that's a good thing. I want to tell you, I was having a conversation with my mom yesterday while I was at work. I was there by myself. Jana went home early because we recorded our podcast earlier in the day. And I sent her home because none of the girls came in to press close yesterday. Saturday. So it was, there was no point for us to both be there all day. So I sent her home, and, sometimes I quite like working by myself. I don't know, even if it's busy, I just sometimes prefer to work alone. And when I'm by myself, I talk to my mom, and sometimes we talk on the phone, like, all day long. Every now and then, she'll be like, I gotta call you back, and then she'll call me back, and we spend the majority of the time that I'm at work on the phone. And it's been really nice, because I'm not a big phone talker, and most of the people I know don't like to talk on the phone. But me and my mom do it all the time. And we just talk about anything and everything. And I was telling her about watching Slightly Offensive when this most recent one that John Doyle was on. And I told her, I said, I would like to marry a man like John Doyle. He's too young, obviously, for me. But somebody with his attitude and his beliefs, preferably not Catholic, because I'm not, but somebody that's like that, but just my age, because I do fall in line with a lot of the same beliefs and the conservative leanings that he has, and even religious leanings outside of being Catholic. And that's one thing I look forward to, is I would love to get remarried again. I am not one of these women who's like, oh, my freedom, I'm single, and I love the single life. And while I'm not unhappy being single, I do long to be married and have my family. So and I think that's what women were built for. And I was telling her about the video that he made about Beauty and the Beast being implicitly right-wing. And it makes a lot of sense to me. You should go watch the video. I think I linked it in one of my other episodes for y'all to go watch. And I think you should watch it. And he makes the point that women left unchecked by male authority will descend into chaos. And I think that's true. Anyway, but that's not the point that I was making. I was just telling her some things that he had said that, I tend to agree with on the last Slightly Offensive episode. And I said, I think the funny thing is, and maybe it's not funny, it's just something that I have noticed, that anytime I come onto my podcast and I mention something that I learned, or that someone explained to me, or I heard this, or any story, I typically will give y'all, Matt Walsh, Michael Knowles, Elijah Schaefer, John Doyle, even sometimes Ben Shapiro. And those are the things, Glenn Beck. And I've noticed all of the things that I learn or have explained to me that gives me better understanding of something that I already believe, I learn from men. And I am not saying that you cannot learn things from women, obviously. But I will say, the majority of the time, you learn more things from men than you do from women. And I think that's kind of just the natural order of things. Anyway, I was just having that conversation with my mom, and I just thought it was interesting that That is true, that most of the time when I learn new things, it is coming from a man, because we were talking about mansplaining. And of course, I don't believe in that, but I just thought it was interesting. So I wanted to share that with y'all. Maybe take a look and see if, like, the things that you learn in life, who are you learning it from? Are you learning it from men? Or are you learning it from women? Is it a good mixture of both? I would just be curious to know what other people see. And I also asked a question on my Facebook and Twitter, and I know what I believe the answer is, and I wanted to ask the question because I was having a debate with a couple people on Facebook about, the Bible and things like that. And I wanted to know, with Jesus being the most well-known historical figure and the Bible being the number one selling book in the world, why is it that people are still so ignorant of what the Bible says? And my view of it, and even I did get this answer from somebody, was that once somebody admits to the fact that the Bible is the truth, then they have to take accountability for their behavior and answer to a higher power, and they don't want to do that. And I think that explains it better than anything. So, if you want, you can drop a comment on the video and give me your answer to that question, because I'm curious what other perspectives people see about why that is the case. Anyway, okay, let's read our daily promise today. It says, "For we are laborers together with God. Ye are God's husbandry. Ye are God's building." 1 Corinthians 3:9. Once we have devoted our lives to Christ, we become a working part to future the kingdom of God. We are his field that he cultivates as we produce fruits for his glory. We are the structure of his building as he resides in our hearts. Yet we are only his field and building by the grace of God. The triumph of Christ over death allows us to be used to his glory. After all, to be used of Christ is one of the greatest blessings in the Christian life. Now, speaking of that, where it says that we are the structure of his building as he resides in our hearts, that was another debate that somebody had asked a question about drinking wine. And when they talk about wine, they're talking about alcohol. And most people, I guess, don't really know that when the Bible talks about wine, as in like when Jesus turned the water into wine, they don't mean fermented wine. It was just grape juice. That was their wine. They did not drink alcohol. Not saying that people didn't. Of course they did. But specifically, when it's referring to Jesus doing that, it was just grape juice. It was not fermented. Nobody was getting drunk off of what he was giving them. And if you take a look, that the Bible says that our bodies are the Lord's temple. We're not supposed to destroy it. This is why the Bible talks about it being against tattoos, even against piercings, even as much as just piercings in a girl's ears. That's destroying God's temple, and you're really not supposed to do that. Granted, I have some tattoos. I regret getting them, but there's nothing I can do about that now. And I have my ears pierced, okay? But if we know that we're not supposed to be destroying our bodies as his temple, and we know that alcohol damages your body, your organs, your brain cells, then why would God tell us that it's okay to drink wine? It's not. And also, Proverbs chapter 20, verse 1 says that wine is a mocker and strong drink is raging. So, I think that's a pretty good clue into that we should not be drinking alcohol. Now, I want to get to some stuff today. I really don't know if I'm going to be able to get to everything, because I just watched a Glenn Beck special on the Great Reset. And, I've always learned about the Great Reset as the New World Order. One world government, one world military, things like that. And that takes place during the tribulation. But the Great Reset, I don't think, I've always thought like they're interchangeable, but they're really not when you really think about what exactly the Great Reset is doing. But I mean, I guess it could be, but since the Great Reset is happening here, now, while I'm on Earth, while other Christians are still here, I don't view it as what the Bible speaks about with the New World Order. Now, I know the Bible doesn't use the phrase New World Order, but when they do talk about a one world government and things like that. So, I guess you could make them interchangeable, but also they're quite different in a lot of ways, especially when you're thinking about what time it is happening in. So I'm going to do that first, and if it takes me the whole episode to get through all of that stuff, fine. If not, then I will talk about some of the other things. So, the Great Reset, we know. Let's see if I can find it, which one it was. Okay, well, we know what the Great Reset is, okay? In fact, I want to read you something. So, Glenn Beck just wrote a new book, and it's called, The Great Reset, if I can get the title. One second. It's called The Great Reset, Joe Biden and the Rise of 21st-Century Fascism, okay? So that's what it's called. Now, I have a sample of this on Kindle, and when I get paid, I am going to purchase it. It's $14.99 on Kindle, and he says right now that's where you need to get it, but because of the supply chain issues, he can't get actual books to anybody as of right now. So I want to read you something. First of all, I did an episode where I talked about Klaus Schwab, the executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. And on June 3rd, 2020, he said, "To achieve a better outcome, the world must act jointly and swiftly to revamp all aspects of our societies and economies, from education to social contracts and working conditions. In short, we need a great reset of capitalism." And then John Kerry, who is the special climate envoy for President Biden, discussing the Great Reset at a November 2020 event hosted by the World Economic Forum, said, "Yes, it will happen, and I think it will happen with greater speed and with greater intensity than a lot of people might imagine." Now, here are some of the questions that you should be asking when looking into the Great Reset. And I'm sorry that I cannot show this on my screen for YouTube because I don't have it because it's on my Kindle on my phone. So, some of the questions you should be asking is, why are large corporations becoming the champions of woke causes and engaging in political debates about things like voter identification laws? Why did the stock market grow substantially throughout 2020 and 2021, despite one of the biggest global economic collapses in history? Why did housing prices skyrocket in 2020 and 2021? Why are politicians in both the Democratic and the Republican parties now spending trillions of dollars more than the government takes in? And why aren't they afraid of runaway inflation? Why are central banks all over the world talking about creating their own digital currencies? Why are people who claim that climate change is an existential threat to human life building mansions on islands and beaches despite alleged fears of rising sea levels and flying around the world in private jets that spew carbon dioxide into the atmosphere? Why are social media giants scrambling to stifle speech at every turn? Why are web hosting companies shutting down massive platforms that advocate free speech, silencing millions of people? Why are the heads of numerous Western countries, including Canada, France, the UK, and America, all using the exact same Build Back Better slogan? And we know that comes from the World Economic Forum. Why are leading figures on the left, including Biden, calling for stakeholder capitalism? And what is the difference between stakeholder capitalism and a free market economic model? Why do the American people no longer trust many of our society's most important institutions? Why does the media pay more attention to a tweet from Donald Trump than to a mob burning down a police station or to rioters taking over whole city blocks for days at a time? Why can't we have an honest dialogue anymore? Why has the political discourse become so vitriolic? Why are people on the ideological right and left being canceled over the slightest societal misstep? Why were the size and scope of the coronavirus-related stimulus programs so large? Why did government officials distribute thousands of dollars to families who never lost their jobs or suffered from any economic hardships during the pandemic? Why were massive corporations allowed to stay open during the COVID-19 pandemic while many small businesses were forced to close? Why has Biden worked so hard to impose coronavirus vaccine mandates on Americans, regardless of whether they have already developed natural immunity? Why are people who have been vaccinated forced in many states to wear masks in public places, even when there are very few people present? If you don't know the answer to all of these questions, it is because you have yet to fully understand the Great Reset, the single most important topic I have covered in my career, and the movement that could finally snuff out the flame of liberty in America. Now, of course, Glenn Beck never expects you to just agree with what he says. He wants you to take what he says, he wants you to research it yourself and come to your own conclusions, but to do it with an open mind. And he says if you do that, you will agree that the United States, and indeed the entirety of Western civilization, is in grave peril because of the Great Reset. Only strong resistance from those who believe in democratic principles and individual liberty can stop it. Now, I have more to read from there, but first we're going to talk about everything, and then I am going to read another excerpt from the book, because I want you to pay attention to what it says. So first, I want to tell you what the difference between stakeholder capitalism and the free market is. So if you look at the definition of stakeholder capitalism, so it's a theory, and it's a system in which corporations are oriented to serve the interest of all their stakeholders. Among the key stakeholders are customers, suppliers, employees, and shareholders. Okay? Now, if you take stakeholder capitalism against the free market, so the free market is, I'll use the example that Glenn Beck used, is you have a McDonald's, and they choose a place to build a McDonald's based on the demand for it. Well, all these people, they like to eat here. This is where we're going to do really good business. We're going to build it here. So they build it based on the demographic of what kind of business they're going to get. They're not going to build it somewhere where they're not going to get business. But stakeholder capitalism is when the government comes in and with the private sectors and says, we're not going to build a McDonald's here because you're fat. Y'all are all fat and you can't eat this kind of food. So we're going to build a garden and we're just going to give you like leafy greens and things like that because you are a burden on the healthcare system because of the way you eat. So we're going to do this instead. Now, so stakeholder capitalism is one of those ideas that works great on a t-shirt and makes people feel more clever than they actually are. Stakeholder capitalism is the theory that firms should be accountable to their stakeholders instead of their shareholders. Meaning, instead of serving their owners and being accountable to their owners, they should cater to the desires of the nebulous society. One of the reasons it's a stupid idea is for the same reason that design by committee is a stupid idea. So here's a comic that explains it. How the customer explained it. It's a tree with 3 swings on top of each other. How the project leader understood it. It's a swing that can't swing because the tree's in the way. how the analyst designed it. It's a tree that is cut in half between the stump and the actual tree and being held up by two limbs and branches with a swing going between the broken part. How the programmer wrote it, it's broken. How the business consultant described it, it's a real comfy chair. How the project was documented, they didn't cover any of that. What operations installed, just a rope. How the customer was billed, like you're on a roller coaster. How it was supported, it wasn't. And what the customer really needed, just a tire swing. So the problem is that everyone has different needs, capabilities, desires, understandings, etc. We humans are all different, and it's not just really hard to try and satisfy all the stakeholders. It's impossible. Okay, so, and I've covered stakeholder capitalism before, so I'm not going to spend a good deal of time on what that is. But what I can tell you that goes along with the Great Reset is ESG scores. Now, what is an ESG score, you might ask? Well, from ESGthereport.com, ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance. An ESG score is a measurement of a company's level of sustainability. The calculation is based on many factors, and an ESG score can range from 1 to 100. It takes into account everything from their environmental impact to how they treat their employees in order to establish if they're meeting best practices in these areas. The result of this score is then used by investors when deciding whether or not to invest in a certain company's shares. In addition, as more companies begin incorporating ESGs into their business plans due to pressure from investors, some have seen improved performance as well as increased stock prices at the time of IPO or initial public offering. This has been attributed both to investor demand for sustainable investments and the fact that ESGs can lower the cost of doing business for a company, such as reducing waste and energy costs. Any score below 50 is considered poor, while anything above 70 would be considered a good score. With recent global weather events erasing any doubt about climate change, except to see every business come under scrutiny for their ESG practices, the best way to avoid any negative attention is get ahead of the curve by learning how to write a report before you are asked if you have one. So, it says here that it's been found that poor ESG scores lead to increased poverty levels in areas where these companies are located, while also leading to decreased employee morale and motivation. Now, if you want to notice, this is giving a prop up of an ESG score. So the reason it's good is it can also lead to increased benefits for employees and a healthier company. It's been seen that an increase in an ESG score correlates with increases in innovation, productivity, and profitability. This is due to the fact that companies with a good ESG score have more engaged employees who are willing to take more risks and innovate. In addition to this, there are benefits for the environment as well. As companies improve their ESGs, they'll be able to reduce their resource consumption and waste levels, which will result in a healthier planet. So, the effects of poor ESG scores, they say. We know that it leads to pollute local waterways, leading to issues such as higher numbers of people suffering from cancer due to the chemicals from these companies getting into drinking water. Also, it leads to increased poverty levels, okay? Now, who uses these? They are used by investors when looking at a potential investment to determine whether or not they'll be able to get a good return on their investment. However, if the company has an extremely low ESG score, this is seen as creating too much risk for the investor and can lead to them choosing not to invest. ESG ratings are also used by companies themselves to determine which areas they should improve in order to have a better score overall. So the score is based on ESG factors, which include environmental factors like greenhouse gas emissions, waste production, and energy consumption. It can also take into account how companies are addressing climate change by reducing their environmental impact or by investing in renewable energy sources. The score encompasses social factors like employee satisfaction, diversity initiatives, and business ethics standards. Finally, it looks at governance issues such as executive pay, transparency policies, and shareholder rights. So, who calculates the score? It's calculated by third-party companies who specialize in the field. You have MSCI, Sustainalytics, and ISS that provide ESG scores for thousands of companies. So, for example, MSCI uses a quantitative score based on GRI and SRI guidelines as well as qualitative evaluation, while ISS has a team of experts who assess data points based on indicators drawn from the most current publicly available information. So, I'm not going to continue reading any more about that. What I am going to do is I want to talk about the grand plan to control when it comes to your ESG score. Okay? So this is from ifapray.org, Intercessors for America. Okay. So here it says, in June 2020, elites from around the world gathered to announce the launch of a plan to reset the entire global economy, a proposal they ominously named the Great Reset. Among the many world leaders and powerful institutions that pledged their support for the Great Reset at the June meeting were the International Monetary Fund, Prince Charles, the head of the United Nations, CEOs for major international corporations, and the World Economic Forum, one of the key ringleaders of the Great Reset. The initial justification for the Great Reset was the COVID-19 pandemic, but from the start, supporters of the global economic overhaul repeatedly said that climate change was the long-term justification, the one that would allow a sustained, massive transformation of society. Doing nothing, they argued, would pose an existential threat to the human race, a completely ludicrous argument many on the left continuously make without a shred of solid scientific evidence to support the claim. Among the most important figures in the Great Reset movement are gigantic financial institutions and or their CEOs, including Bank of America and MasterCard. Although many Great Reset supporters have called for dramatic expansions of government welfare programs, including job guarantees, government-provided health care, etc., the heart of the Great Reset is something called environmental, social, and governance metrics. That is your ESG. So they offer public policy leaders, economists, investors, and banks an entirely new way of evaluating businesses. Instead of looking at how profitable a company is, how many employees it has, its business model, and other traditional metrics, ESG adds to those concerns a whole host of left-wing causes, including how green a company is, having the right ratio of minorities, whether a business is involved in politically disfavored industries such as gun manufacturing and sales, as well as other similar considerations. ESG systems, sustainable investment, and forcing the world to adopt quote-unquote green energy sources are all essential elements of the Great Reset plan to transform the world. In February 2021, Bank of America, citing its long-standing support for the Paris Climate Agreement, announced, quote, the company today outlined initial steps to achieve its goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions in its financing activities, operations, and supply chain before 2050, end quote. Note that the net zero greenhouse gas emissions rule will be applied not only to Bank of America's own operations and supply chain, meaning every company that does business with Bank of America, but also its financing activities. Of course, Bank of America isn't the only bank with these policies. Wells Fargo CEO Charlie Scharf made a comparable announcement on March 8th. Citi, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and JP Morgan Chase, which together with Wells Fargo and Bank of America make up the 6 largest banks in the United States, also made similar commitments. Some financial institutions have already started to give ESG scores to individual investment accounts, as Glenn Beck has repeatedly noted, sending a clear signal that everyone will be required to adopt the Great Reset in the coming years. If banks are allowed to collectively decide to stop financing any group of people they want based on not financial concerns but ideological considerations, then banks and their Great Reset allies will have, in effect, near total control over society, especially if they begin to tie lending decisions to a vast ESG system. And we don't just mean lending to businesses being started. We're talking commercial real estate, residential real estate, car loans, anything like that, investing in the stock market. It will cover all of it. So if you think because you don't own a business, you will not be affected, you're wrong. Everyone is affected, which is why they wanted to start monitoring people's bank transactions. And they wanted to do it at $600. Then they changed it to $10,000. And they worded it in such a way to make people think that if you made a $10,000 transaction, that you would be monitored. No. It's if you make transactions of totaling $10,000 in a 12-month period. So the fact that you pay rent every month, that would qualify you to being monitored by the federal government. Because most people, well, let's just say you pay $1,000 a month for your rent. Well, that's $12,000 a year. You are being monitored because of those rent payments. Not to mention everything else that you use your bank to pay. Interestingly, in January 2021, the Trump-era Office of the Comptroller of the Currency issued a finalized Fair Access to Financial Services regulation that would have made it illegal for large banks to engage in this sort of discrimination. But just 1 week after entering the White House, Biden paused the rule's implementation, signaling his clear intention to eliminate the rule before it ever has a chance to be published in the Federal Register. The time has come for massive populist revolt against the Great Reset, one that will hopefully have the same success as the grassroots movement against Common Core did under the Obama administration. So, that is what the ESG is, and that's what it's going to do, and it's going to affect everybody. And if you look on the Bank of America website, where it talks about the ESG reports, this is what they say. Bank of America. We demonstrate our commitment to transparency by disclosing our environmental, social, and governance impacts through a number of reporting frameworks. We make these disclosures because we believe it is important that stakeholders, including our clients, teammates, communities, and shareholders, so there's that stakeholder capitalism, not just the shareholders, but everybody, anybody who has stake in it. You don't hold shares in Bank of America, but you have stake in it because you're a customer, or you live in the community where the Bank of America is. Understand how we manage ESG issues and have better insight into how we are living our values and delivering on our purpose to drive responsible growth. Citizens Journal also wrote about the ESG scores, and it says that I learned about Agenda 21 from Christopher Mockton, Margaret Thatcher's science advisor. As I listened to him speak, I took out my iPad and went to the UN website. There it was. I went home and read all 40 chapters of it. I was stunned. I couldn't believe any American citizen, anyone who grew up in this wonderful country, could have supported or signed on to such an agreement. I couldn't believe anyone would condemn the American people to such a fate. It is an agreement that goes against everything this country stands for, everything this country was founded on, everything the entire Western civilization stood for. But we did, and so did the rest of the Western countries. The left likes to say it's a conspiracy theory, and I wish it were. Our beloved Nancy Pelosi introduced it to Congress in October of 1992, yet another reason to despise this woman. Others have argued that it was never ratified, so it isn't enforceable. It was signed by George Herbert Walker Bush. I suggest they look up the Treaty on Treaties we signed in 1969. Essentially, it says a treaty signed by a head of state is valid unless the legislative body votes it down. If it isn't brought to a vote, it's valid. I asked why we didn't know about Agenda 21 and now the UN 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development, something that would change our lives so dramatically, something we didn't vote for and weren't asked if we want it. Why isn't the media reporting on it? The media doesn't report on it because they support it and they know we wouldn't. Each year, the UN holds two important summits, the World Urban Forum and the World Economic Forum. The Urban Forum is for public officials from all the signature countries, governors, mayors, city planners, city councils, etc., or their equivalent. The Economic Summit is for multinational corporations and companies. I went to the World Urban Forum in Malaysia 2 years ago. I knew what they planned, but I still couldn't imagine how they were going to implement it in the United States. I kept thinking it was against our Constitution. We would vote against people who were for it. We would fight against it in the courts. I was naive. The World Economic Forum has wargamed all the scenarios we might come up with to fight this. COVID has taught all of us some sobering lessons. After the first extension of the 15 days to flatten the curve, I told friends they would never let us out. If the World Urban and Economic Forum's goals are to control us worldwide, why would they? And after a year, many states are still locked down and we're being threatened with more lockdowns. I also observed that the government was getting around the Constitution by having companies mandate masks. I wondered why companies were being so helpful, especially when the science doesn't support it. I still couldn't believe any rational thinking person could possibly think mask mandates and lockdowns, considering science doesn't support them, the Green New Deal, which has little to do with reducing CO2, H.R. 1, or open borders are constitutional or good for the country. The arguments the left make in support of them aren't factual. They are on their face ridiculous. For instance, 75% of voters support voter ID, and 76% of voters support secure borders. The only people we hear in support of these radical ideas are the media and politicians. The rest of us are censored. The Democrats are aware the majority of us want voter ID, voter integrity, and a secure border, but they don't care. They don't have to care. A few days ago, a very long list of companies came out in opposition to Georgia's voter integrity law and in support of H.R. 1. Companies like American Express, Google, Bank of America, Viacom, CBS, Apple, Facebook, Coca-Cola, Delta, and others. They are threatening not to do business with Georgia, not to have sporting events there, etc. They and Hollywood will boycott and browbeat Georgia until they surrender, and now the same is happening to Texas. But the World Economic Forum had a solution to force all of this on us. I heard about ESG scores, but I had not yet researched them. I have now. The E stand, okay, so we know what it is. Okay. These companies have to report every pay period what they have done to improve the environment, what they have done for equity, and what they have done to help government or left-wing policies. If they aren't trying to get to zero emissions, or don't have enough minorities, or aren't giving critical race theory classes, or aren't supporting some government-sanctioned policy, their score will be lowered. If they have a low score, that will mean the banks won't loan them money, or take away their ability to process credit cards, or even take away their ability to do banking. This is why so many are on board with all of these extreme policies. The ESG scores are already in practice, and we, you and I, are next. Some of you may remember Bank of America going through customers' accounts and reporting to the FBI customers who were in D.C. on January 6th. They got a higher ESG score for that one. What they did was unconstitutional, but so what? The Constitution means nothing to the left. We need to understand this isn't an American Republican-Democrat fight. This is the left of the world against the Western civilization fight. And tragically, most of the leaders of the Western civilization are for it too. Canada, Australia, England, all of Europe, as far as I know, are for it. Poland, the Czech Republic, some other Eastern European countries, and America when Trump was president, but not now, are the only ones I can think of that are against it. So you're talking even Russia would be against it. It doesn't really matter who is against it. Banks and corporations are going to impose this on us. As I guess with the mask mandate, companies are circumventing the Constitution instead of the government. This is a public-private partnership. Banks will go through our statements and credit card purchases and give us each an ESG score. If yours is low, they won't give you a car loan or mortgage or a personal loan. They may even not allow you to bank. How do you think the banks are going to score gun manufacturers or ammunition manufacturers? They'll just not allow them to use bank or process credit cards. You may not be able to sell your house if it isn't up to G&D regulations, and the bank might not loan you the money to bring it up to the regulations. Considering they want to end private property, that's a good start. If you think this won't happen, it already is. Our friend Brandon Straka, founder of Walkaway, has been permanently banned from Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, where he had millions of followers. He had been banned from crowdfunding sites, and his bank accounts and credits are closed. Oh, and he was also evicted from his home. What is he to do? How does he function, pay his bills, live his life? How would you? Look what they did to our former President Trump, when as an ex-president ever been silenced. This is happening to many conservatives, and it's coming to each of us soon. As John Kerry said, the Great Reset will happen at greater speed and intensity than people might imagine. 11 things you can do to help stop the Great Reset. This is by Glenn Beck and Justin Haskins. The foundation of the American way of life is freedom from tyranny, which can only exist in a nation that defends the rights, powers, and property of individuals and families. Over the past 2 centuries, the greatest threats to liberty have come from governments, both foreign and domestic. And from the beaches of Normandy to the civil rights movement of the 1960s, Americans have repeatedly conquered the challenges placed before them by those seeking to extinguish or limit individual rights. However, over the past few years, a new potentially catastrophic danger has emerged, but not primarily from the halls of Congress or state capitals. This threat to freedom has largely emanated from the boardrooms of the world's wealthiest, most powerful corporations, large financial institutions, central banks, and international organizations such as the United Nations and World Economic Forum. In an attempt to secure vast amounts of wealth and influence over society, corporate CEOs, bankers, and investors, working closely with key government officials, have launched a unified effort to impose environmental, social, and governance standards on most of the industrialized global economy. ESG standards are also referred to as sustainable investment or stakeholder capitalism. According to a report by KPMG, thousands of companies located in more than 50 countries already have ESG systems in place, including 82% of large companies in the United States. ESG standards are designed to create a great reset of capitalism and to revamp all aspects of our society and economies, from education to social contracts and working conditions. ESG supporters plan to enact those radical changes by using ESG schemes to alter how businesses and investments are evaluated, so that instead of focusing on the quality of goods and services, profits, and other traditional economic metrics, companies, including financial institutions, are evaluated largely on their commitment to social justice and environmental causes, and then assigned scores so that companies can be compared, rewarded, or potentially punished. Supporters of the movement for a Great Reset also plan on using technology to limit free speech and privacy rights, and they support creating vast new government programs that are designed to transform the Western economy via the Green New Deal, European Green Deal, and a federal jobs guarantee and basic income programs. Together, the proposals that make up the Great Reset represent the most serious threat to freedom in the West since the fall of the Soviet Union and perhaps since World War II. But there is hope. We can stop the Great Reset, but only if we act quickly and with great conviction. Below are 11 steps you can take to push back against the Great Reset. These steps represent a powerful bottom-up, grassroots approach to the Great Reset's top-down plan to remake the world. Although many of these steps won't be easy for everyone to take, they are essential for ensuring that our children and grandchildren will grow up in a world that protects the rights of individuals and empowers families rather than wealthy special interests, financial institutions, and large corporations. Number 1, live not by lies. The time for remaining quiet is over. When you hear or see something that you know to be false, speak up. Be kind, generous, and compassionate, but do not, under any circumstances, allow lies to infect your life. Further, do not support organizations, publications, politicians, schools, or any other institutions that regularly promote false claims. Number 2, buy local. The reason the Great Reset is so powerful is because so many of us have become totally dependent on large multinational corporations. They can be easily manipulated in a way that small local businesses cannot. Learn to buy local whenever possible, even if it means spending more money on your purchases. Yes, big corporations offer conveniences and low prices that many small businesses can't compete with, but those benefits come with a great cost: your freedom. Number 3, bank local. Big financial institutions and banks are driving much of the Great Reset movement. They have started to use their incredible wealth and power to alter society by financing only those businesses who agree to the terms of the Great Reset. This problem is going to get worse, so it's important to find local banks and credit unions you can trust and who refuse to utilize ESG scores and other discriminatory schemes. Number 4, support local farms. If you live in an area that has local farms and farmers markets, consider buying as many of your groceries as possible from farmers. In the future, food production and distribution are going to change dramatically. It's important that you support local farmers and build relationships with individuals who can provide you with the goods you need in a time of crisis. One of our main goals must be to make local communities as self-sufficient as possible, and that cannot happen unless we support local farms. Number 5, be vocal. After starting to shop and bank locally, be sure to tell big financial institutions and corporations why they have lost your business. They need to know that their decisions have serious consequences. And I can tell you, I bank locally. I bank at Pinnacle Bank of Texas. And it is such an awesome bank. One of the easiest banks I've ever dealt with, and friendly, and they really take care of their customers. And I suggest if you want to pull out of, say, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, after looking into all of this, Pinnacle Bank of Texas is a good one. Number 6, run for local government. Local and state governments will soon be our most important defense against the Great Reset. Consider running for your local school board, zoning board, or even for a state legislative office. If you don't feel qualified for these positions, find someone who shares your values and help them run for office. If we don't have control of our local governments, we won't be able to halt the Great Reset. I've said before that I would not want to be in government, whether at the local level, like within your community, your state, your county, state, definitely not federal. But more and more, I am looking at the prospect of maybe it would be a good idea for me to run for a government office, an elected office, because I want what we believe is best for our communities and for the individuals and for families. And there's not a lot of people I trust to do that. But I do trust myself because I know what I want, and I know that other people that agree with me, that we talk about this stuff, and I hope that they would trust me to be able to do what was right and fight against all of this. So here's the news here. I don't know how you do it. I don't know where you get the money from. I really don't know how to even get started. But it is something I am heavily considering doing, at the very least in White Settlement, at the very most in Tarrant County, and maybe eventually move up to the state level. So there you go. You heard it here first. My announcement to run. Number 7, demand that your state pass laws against ESG scores. So I'm not going to read all of these little parts to it because, we know. It's pretty self-explanatory what you're supposed to do. But we can pass laws that makes the use of ESG metrics and other similar systems by financial institutions illegal. So we should do that. Number 8, make responsible spending a key issue for politicians. So politicians on the ideological left and right have totally abandoned responsible fiscal policy in favor of vast money printing and loose monetary policies. And after we cover these 11, I will tell you why they do that. The many trillions of dollars that have been printed in recent years put our economy at risk and are being used to fuel the Great Reset. Without these trillions of dollars of printed money, it would be exceptionally difficult for governments and financial institutions to buy off corporations. Number 9, organize anti-Great Reset groups. No matter where you live, there are Americans in your community who do not support the Great Reset. Republicans, Democrats, and independents alike. Find like-minded neighbors and organize a local, peaceful resistance. Find people you can trust and agree to support one another when times get tough. Now, more than ever, we need to develop dependable communities. And let me tell you, there are more people out there who think like you and agree with you than do not. The point is that the government, the federal government, media, they want you to believe you are alone and powerless to stop it. But I'm telling you, we are not. We are the majority. We're just being censored, so we can't get in touch with each other. This is why you can't do it on social media. You have to meet in person. That's what you have to start doing. Organizing and doing it in person. Because social media is not going to cut it. Number 10, buy property and diversify. Property ownership is going to become increasingly more difficult in the months and years to come. It's important that you work with a qualified financial advisor to help you figure out the best way to buy property and diversify your investments. You should also be investing in gold, silver, precious metals. I'm telling you, you probably should do it if you have the ability. I don't have the ability to do it. I wish I did, but I don't at the moment. But if you do, that's what you should do. And also invest in ammo and guns. Number 11, make the Great Reset a litmus test for politicians. So before supporting politicians, find out if they know what the Great Reset is and what they plan to do to stop it. If they aren't familiar with the Great Reset or don't have a plan to halt it, then demand that they learn about the Great Reset and develop a proposal to prevent it. Political leaders who refuse to take the Great Reset seriously do not deserve your support. This is the key issue of our generation. That's a big thing I'm going to be looking for the 2022 elections. Are they talking about it, which none of them are, and what do they plan to do to stop it, which clearly they don't. Now, let me tell you, excuse me, let me tell you why the politicians, left and right, print limited money. If you haven't heard about it, modern monetary theory, MMT, this is from Investopedia.com. So, modern monetary theory is a heterodox macroeconomic framework that says monetarily sovereign countries like the US, UK, Japan, and Canada, which spend, tax, and borrow in a fiat currency that they fully control, are not operationally constrained by revenues when it comes to federal government spending. Put simply, such governments do not rely on taxes or borrowing for spending, since they can print as much as they need and are the monopoly issuers of the currency. Since their budgets aren't like a regular household's, their policies should not be shaped by fears of rising national debt. Let me give you a little thing about MMT. The reason why the government is not worried about runaway inflation is because in order for them to print and spend unlimited amounts of money, they need a few things in place. They need complete control over the products, production, and the labor, but they also need control over consumer spending. And that is the only way that they can do what they do. And now that came from Glenn Beck explaining exactly what it is. So the last thing that I'm going to look at is from libertyfirst.org. And we're going to talk about the money problem, the printing of money, and the inflation problem here in the U.S. Given the wild budget proposals of the Biden administration, it is evident that most party functionaries buy into her theory, which is the modern monetary theory, and it's by Stephanie Kelton, okay? And it was an aide to Senate Democrats Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and they achieved wild influence within the Democrat Party, okay? The deficit myth, modern monetary theory, and the birth of the people's economy. This is a review, okay? Now, this is a working theory out of control, is the name of this article. So, the Wuhan virus crisis gave advocates the perfect opportunity to not only increase deficit spending, but also to pass out money directly to the public, directly in the form of checks. As a result, M2 money supply, a key determinant of inflation, has been soaring. While hardly a year into the Biden administration, inflation has become a serious problem. Yes, we know about supply chain issues from China, the cost of shipping, and the hundreds of ships that can't get into port. That might explain part of it, but we don't get our food and fuel from China, and these are items going up the most. Besides, Biden has overstimulated an economy that was already starting to come back from the stupid and flawed lockdown policy to deal with the virus. This was followed by massive injections of money directly to the public and unemployment benefits so generous it has created a labor shortage. This has even some left-leaning economists like Jason Furman and Lawrence Summers concerned. And I said this at the beginning, that this was going to be a big problem giving out all this extra money. And that you're going to end up paying it back anyway, so it's not free money, by the way. Now, the inflation problem has everything to do with printing excessive amounts of money and then heaping on regulatory and Wuhan virus policies that stifle production and work. Without delving into granular detail into the theory of MMT, which we've done elsewhere, the theory basically points that deficits don't matter, that printing money does not cause inflation, and that if inflation does become a problem, it can be dealt with by raising taxes. So for the moment, if we accept their premises, faulty though they may be, we can demonstrate the theory still does not hold together from an operational point of view. It might operate successfully under a dictator, but it is dysfunctional in a constitutional republic that has dispersed centers of power, a central bank with nominal independence, and still large elements of operationally free markets. So, for example, money creation is largely a purview of the Federal Reserve, which bows to politics on occasion, but on occasion is also independent. They create money when they buy government debt, Money is also created when banks make loans, which low interest rates encourage, and said rates are largely under Fed control. Interest rates are a function of both free market forces and Fed policy. The excessive deficits we suffer from are not yet causing rates to rise markedly yet, because the Fed buys the bonds before they ever come on the market. Where did the Fed get the money to buy them? Well, they created the money out of thin air. However, the deficit is under the control of Congress, and the Fed may or may not monetize all of it. If the Fed decides to reduce its bond purchases, or in today's parlance, taper, rates will start to rise against an enormous debt bubble supporting overinflated equity prices. For some time, the growth of banks' reserves did not cause excessive consumer price inflation because the money stayed largely within the banking system and elevated financial assets like stocks and real estate. However, MMT advocated the direct injection of money to consumers, which began under Trump and has followed in spades on under Biden. A good working definition of inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. So when you print vast amounts of money and then shut production down through stupid COVID policies, you have set up a perfect storm of more money, fewer goods. Now, under the theory of MMT, when inflation becomes a problem, the excess money thus created can be sopped up by raising taxes. Even within the confines of this theory, things can't work out if taxes are not raised. So what if Congress runs up huge deficits? Those deficits are monetized because the Fed buys them, but then the Congress can't see its way clear to raise taxes. It's not whether we are right now. It's not that where we are right now. The Congress spent the money and sent out checks to anyone who can fog a mirror. Demand is surging. The Fed is monetizing. Supply is constrained. But suddenly a few Democrats like Manchin and Sinema have second thoughts about crushing taxation. Understand? We side with Manchin and Sinema. We just want to point out their theory said inflation can be stopped by raising taxes. What if Congress gets cold feet? They're already getting significant political blowback on inflation. Biden is tumbling in the polls, and now politicians are supposed to raise taxes and suffer the political fallout from that. This may not be smart given elections for Congress are, well, now this year. In short, the theory did not appreciate that Fed printing and congressional tax raising might be hard to coordinate as easily as the theory suggests. It is not as if Stephanie Kelton is the pilot flying something as complex as the economy who can just pull levers at will. Competing agencies are working, political log rolling is going on, and the opposition party in Congress is only behind by a few votes, 1 or 2 Democrat defectors, and the taxes don't go through. So, what if MMT sets loose inflation in the land, but the government cannot take the steps to rein it in? Moreover, the government is not in charge of what elements of the free market that are still free and left to operate. Consumers, for example, if they feel prices will be going higher, start buying in advance of inflation, hoping to acquire goods before they go up further in price. Businesses may want to accelerate inventory accumulation, buying needed goods and components before they too go higher in price. Lenders and savers may require higher interest rates because present rates provide negative rates well below the rate of inflation. All the aforementioned steps by private actors are a rational response to a government deliberately funding itself through currency inflation. Once this psychology takes hold, it is extremely difficult to break. In terms of mainline monetary theory, free market forces, or the willingness to lend and borrow, can influence the money supply. The psychology of investors, consumers, and entrepreneurs can influence the velocity of money turnover. When inflationary psychology takes hold, prices can race upward because the velocity of money rises somewhat independently of its quantity. People want to spend the money before it loses further value. A given quantity of money will turn over faster and faster. Now, what happens to the elegant MMT theory? It is evident that even with this, is that schema or scheme? I don't know what it's trying to say. Set out in MMT, it cannot work in a constitutional republic where both houses of Congress can act independently, the Fed can act somewhat independently, the executive can act independently, the bureaucracy can act independently, and what is left of free markets can act independently. MMT advocates actually use the metaphor of monetary sink filling with money. When it starts to overflow, simply drain excess money through taxation. Well, what if the drain clogs due to politics and turf disputes between independent agencies and branches of government? You then get serious inflation. The implementation of MMT policies only could work if there was a dictator and no free market. Are we supposed to give up our constitutional republic and prosperity so their theory can have a chance at working? MMT then runs into the information problem. Hayek and other Austrian economists have pointed out, how much should the money supply grow? What is the right level of inflation? What is the correct level of interest rates? How many cars should be built? How much oil should be pumped? Or how much corn should be grown? In the absence of a free market, politicians can only guess, and they are truly guessing because the only right price and right quantity are those that will allow the market to be clear. Otherwise, you wind up with shortages or surpluses. In the absence of free markets, how could one know? This is the internal hubris of MMT. It supposes that experts can know these things, and secondly, it points that having this knowledge, politicians and appointed bureaucrats can pull levers and spin dials as if the political system is some unitary and coordinated mechanism. That is certainly not how things work in a democratic system with dispersed power among both agencies and branches of government. MMT was wrong in its economic assumptions and terribly wrong in its description of how the system would be implemented and controlled in the real world. Unfortunately, it appears our government is enthralled with this flawed and naive theory. Central planning has never worked, not under communism or fascism. Finally, it is worthwhile to reiterate the flawed assumption of MMT insofar as its effect on citizens. Having once started inflation under their theory, the answer is high taxation. That leaves the citizen in the difficult position of suffering the confiscation of his wealth either through taxation or inflation or both. Frankly, we would like the opportunity to avoid choosing any of those outcomes. So, to break it down, MMT, which is what the government's trying to do, printing and spending unlimited amounts of money. But the inflation is rising, and the only way to fix it is to raise our taxes. But some people in Congress don't want to do that because they understand the implications of raising taxes on a people already hurting. So, what do they need? They need to get rid of the free market through the Great Reset with the Esg scores and things like that. Then they control all of the products, the production, the labor, and the way you spend the money. And if they have control over all of that, we no longer live in America. It'll be the end of our liberty. I can promise you that. Now, I obviously cannot get to anything else that I had brought up to talk about today. That's fine. I'll do it later in the week. Hopefully, I'll have time to do another podcast this week. I know this is a long episode. I get it. And I'm sorry. What I wanted to read to you really quickly is another excerpt from Glenn Beck's book, The Great Reset. And I wanted to read this because with everything that's going on, if we do not do something to fight back and to stop this from happening, this is what we have to look forward to. This is from A Brave, Terrifying New World, where he has the word brave marked out. This is what our future is going to look like if we don't do something to stop it. The date is August 29th, 2040. 2 decades after world leaders gathered at the World Economic Forum's 2020 event to formulate a plan for imposing a great reset of the global economic system, life in America has dramatically changed. The rules, social norms, and market economic principles that used to define the American experience have been permanently rewritten. The economy, once driven by the wants and needs of the individual consumer, is now guided by an agenda crafted by a cabal of international elites. Despite having been marketed as a solution to all of society's ills, the Great Reset agenda has left everyday Americans worse off than ever before and increasingly dependent on the government and wealthy global corporations that serve as the foundation of this brave and terrifying new world. After committing to the principles of the Great Reset, Congress passed a version of the Green New Deal. The legislation has wiped out more than 10 million jobs supported by the oil and gas industry, devastating the economies of Colorado, North Dakota, Pennsylvania, Texas, and other states that once benefited from fracking and other forms of conventional energy development. 1 billion solar panels and more than 1 million wind turbines have been constructed across the United States, destroying tens of millions of acres of land. Hundreds of thousands of additional acres have been decimated by the thousands of miles of new power lines and extensive mining operations needed to obtain the natural resources used to build America's expansive wind and solar facilities. Millions of birds and bats, including endangered species, are killed every year by the massive spinning blades of America's vast wind farms. Millions of other animals have been displaced following the collapse of countless ecosystems resulting from the destruction caused by developers building new renewable energy facilities. Energy prices have more than tripled in many parts of the country. In places with less sunshine and wind, energy prices are 5 times higher. Blackouts are common, especially in regions with frigid winters. The widespread construction that occurred under the reset's rapid transformation of America's energy sector has replaced some of the jobs lost in the oil and gas industry, but millions of additional jobs, many of which were once located in America's heartland, have been shipped overseas as manufacturers and other energy-intensive industries have fled in droves to nations with lower prices for electricity and other forms of energy. As a result, hundreds of cities and towns across the United States have been economically depressed. Restaurants, food vendors, and grocery stores limit meat sales to help battle climate change. High-fat and sugary foods are restricted or banned outright. Gasoline-powered cars have been outlawed or rendered useless by the elimination of fossil fuels. Air travel has decreased dramatically as prices have increased because of harsh regulations on carbon dioxide emissions. Americans have been promised a new national network of high-speed rail, but more than 10 years into its construction, little progress has been made as environmentalists, concerned communities, and politicians continue to fight over the location of the rail lines. Taxes on businesses have doubled, and a slew of new sales, wealth, and real estate levies have been created by government officials in an attempt to create greater economic equity. America's wealthiest business owners and innovators have left the country and moved to competitor nations that refuse to go along with the Great Reset, flooding those nations with hundreds of billions of dollars in new wealth. The group of Americans hit hardest by the economic exodus are lower income and working class families. Nearly 3/4 of Americans now depend on the federal government for many basic goods and services. Tens of millions of working-age adults refuse to find a job and instead live off of the government's basic income system. Millions of others are employed by federal or state government agencies through the national government's Job Guarantee Program. The federal government routinely runs deficits of $10 trillion or more. The national debt has surpassed $100 trillion. International unease about the strength of the U.S. dollar galvanized the world's largest economies to develop a new currency for international transactions, causing investors and foreign banks to flood American markets with their cash. Historically high levels of inflation in key industries followed, pushing the United States into a second Great Depression. National GDP has been sluggish at best for more than a decade. A new federal agency, the U.S. Department of Environmental, Social, and Governance Compliance, has been created to develop and maintain an ever-shifting series of standards that determine which American businesses are permitted to trade in the country's largest stock exchanges, as well as who can receive the hundreds of billions of dollars pumped into the corporations every year by government officials desperate to keep more companies from heading overseas. Many businesses spend hundreds of thousands or even millions of dollars every year attempting to meet ESG standards, and every corporation is required to have an ESG compliance officer on its board of directors, matching standards that had already been in place for decades in China. In line with the standards created by the U.S. Department of Environmental, Social, and Governance Compliance, businesses shift their product development toward causes endorsed by and favoring elites in government and businesses. Every American corporation is forced to report the racial and gender demographics of its staff and management and to justify every hiring decision made over the past year. Gun and ammunition manufacturers and sellers, frequent targets of government bureaucrats, are effectively forced to close their doors due to overwhelming regulatory compliance costs. Individual investors, large and small, are given specialized ratings for their investments. Investors who attempt to earn money in those businesses that the ruling class considers to be undesirable for society, like candy stores, vape shops, and ranches, are punished with financial penalties. Newly structured ESG-compliant corporations wield more influence than ever over society. Private ownership of most products is a thing of the past. Housing, automobiles, and many other key goods are now available only as services offered by corporations. Most consumers rent products instead of buying, not because they want to, but because they can't afford to own property anymore. Everyday Americans' credit scores, the ratings used by financial institutions to determine creditworthiness for credit cards, car loans, and mortgages, among other things, are no longer based on traditional financial metrics. Instead, Financial institutions use consumers' browser history, social media activity, and other previously private user information from tech devices to craft credit scores for the Americans still wealthy enough to own high-priced property. Individuals and business owners with a history of browsing dangerous websites that dare to challenge the government's official narrative or of searching for concerning topics online are deemed too untrustworthy for many lenders and credit service companies. A national free college tuition plan has put, directly or indirectly, the federal government in charge of virtually every higher education institution in America. Most private colleges, including the vast majority of religious schools, have shut their doors forever or have agreed to become secular public institutions in order to take part in the free tuition plan, which is available only to students attending government-run colleges. Nearly all K-12 school choice programs across the United States have been defunded, pushing thousands of parents to send their children back to their local government-run school district, no matter how dangerous or dysfunctional it is. Parents have virtually no control over curriculum standards. Children spend less time learning about math and science and much more time learning about critical race theory and other social justice topics, causing them to fall even further behind their peers in other developed nations. Using ESG standards as their excuse, social media companies like Facebook and Twitter and search engines such as Google have expanded their content restrictions, banning from their platforms many types of speech, including political and religious speech, which have been labeled offensive, misleading, or misinformation. As a result, tens of millions of voices across the country have been silenced. China, India, and Russia have refused to comply with the Great Reset reforms mandated by newly created climate accords and several international meetings of government and business officials. This has allowed these countries to keep their energy costs down, which in turn provides them with substantial leverage in trade agreements. China and India are now the world's most influential and powerful nations. They use their vast wealth to continue buying large amounts of land and natural resources from developing nations in Asia and Africa, setting the stage for their global dominance over the next 100 years. This is what life looks like in a post-Great Reset world. This is the potential future we must do everything in our power to stop. It sounds very terrifying, depressing, dystopian, but it's so real. It can happen. You don't think that this can happen here? Look at all the other countries where this has happened. It can. And the only way that it happens is because the people, we the people, get lazy and complacent, and we don't want to get uncomfortable by fighting back. We don't want to be labeled a bad name. We just want to live our lives and stay out of it. But let me tell you what. You can no longer just live and let live. You must choose a side, and you must fight. Pick a side, and you should be on the right side. And that side we should make the winning side. This is not a game. This is your life, your children's lives, your grandchildren's lives. Do you want them to live in a world like that? Because I don't. I don't want that for my kids. And it's happening in my kids' generation, and it scares me. I worry for my children all the time because of what is going on. We cannot allow it. End of story. And I'm going to leave it right here. I'm sorry that I took up so much time. Actually, I'm not sorry that I took up so much time. Every now and then, sometimes you just need more time to talk. It happens. So I hope that you've listened to this whole thing because it's very serious. And then I hope you go and watch Glenn Beck's new Great Reset special on YouTube or join Blaze TV. Get a subscription there. It's great because you have so much more access to everything else on the website. But you should go watch it. Of course, he goes into much greater detail than what I did. I was just kind of covering the skim of it. I was skimming the surface, giving you the basics, and then showing you what you have to look forward in the future if you just do nothing. Anyway, you can go find me on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcast, Apple. Go subscribe to the podcast and leave me a review. That would be great. And then head on over to YouTube. Watch my videos. You can like and share them. Leave me a comment. Leave me a comment in answering the questions that I asked earlier in the episode. That would be great. And then subscribe to the channel. That is the best thing you can do for me. But since they don't really mean a lot to subscribe, you do have to hit the notification bell so you know when I upload a new video. I hope this doesn't get taken down off of YouTube. Anyway, I hope you have a good rest of your day, and God bless.